My name is Harper Hayes. I am 32 years old, and last Thanksgiving in Chicago changed my family forever. Growing up, my mother subjected me to cruel, restrictive diets and literal starvation, constantly calling me too heavy. Meanwhile, my sister was allowed to eat freely, filling her plate with whatever she wanted. At our massive holiday dinner, in front of 40 relatives, my mother pointed at my portion and loudly mocked me, saying I was relapsing into my greedy habits. She expected me to shrink in shame and cry. Instead, I calmly wiped my mouth and leaned forward. As a licensed clinical psychologist, I didn't yell. I simply began a cold, clinical dissection of her psychological projection and severe eating disorder, diagnosing her cruelty as a mental illness right at the table. Before I tell you how she reacted to being professionally exposed, hit like, tell me your age in the comments, and welcome back to my channel, where quiet women set loud boundaries and the truth always finds its moment. The kitchen in our Lincoln Park townhouse always smelled like lemon surface cleaner and boiled chicken. My mother Elaine ran that house with the precision of an auditor, but her focus was only ever on my body. While my younger sister Chloe sat at the island eating pasta or ice cream, I stood on a digital scale in the master bathroom. I was 9, the first time Elaine logged my weight in a small green notebook. She told me she was equipping me with discipline. Society punishes heavy women, she would say, smoothing my hair while sliding half my dinner straight into the trash can. Elaine was not a caricature of evil. She was a woman drowning in her own untreated orthorexia and profound body dysmorphia. She measured her own almonds by the gram. She exercised until her joints ached, but she projected the entirety of her terror onto my body. My fatal flaw was that I played along for far too long. I am 32 now. I run a successful private practice in the Loop. I spend my days helping clients draw firm lines with toxic relatives. Yet for 2 decades, I maintained the illusion of peace in my own family. I made the active, flawed decision to intellectualize my mother's abuse rather than stop it. I treated her like a case file instead of a parent who was hurting me. When she made comments about my jawline during a Sunday phone call, I did not hang up. I analyzed her anxiety, labeled her compulsion in my head, and gave her a pass. I thought my doctorate gave me immunity. I thought if I just understood the mechanics of her illness, I could manage it from a safe distance. I was wrong. My complicity alienated me from Chloe. My sister knew the dynamic was warped. I used to catch her looking away when Elaine handed me a plate of steamed vegetables while serving her a second slice of roast. But Chloe chose the safety of being the favored daughter. Standing up for me meant drawing our mother's focus onto herself, so she chose silence. I resented her for it, but I also understood it. I routinely shrank myself to avoid triggering Elaine's anxiety. I wore loose clothing to family events. I ate a full meal before visiting so I could push small amounts of plain food around my plate while she watched. I thought keeping the peace was the professional thing to do, but avoiding a boundary is not the same as having one. My silence just validated her control, setting the stage for her to escalate from private critique to public humiliation. The mistake was showing up at all. I had spent 6 months working with my own therapist on boundary setting, doing the grueling work of untangling my mother's voice from my internal monologue. My therapist had me draft a strict boundary letter, telling me to keep it in my purse as an emergency exit strategy if things went wrong. I convinced myself I would not need it. I treated the drive up Lake Shore Drive to Evanston as a field test, watching the gray November waters of Lake Michigan, truly hoping we could just have a normal dinner and my armor would hold. I was 32 years old, a respected professional with a thriving practice, and I believed I could handle one Thursday evening with 40 extended relatives. I thought I could wear my clinical detachment like a protective coat. I underestimated the sheer gravitational pull of Elaine Hayes, standing in the center of her own territory. Her house was a sprawling colonial, meticulously staged to project generational warmth. It smelled like roasted sage, wood smoke, and pine needles. The driveway was packed with SUVs, and hired caterers had set up a warming tent on the back patio. My mother did not cook for 40 people. She directed a catering staff, which allowed her to spend the entire afternoon circulating, observing, and managing the room. The tension started the moment I handed my coat to a hired attendant in the foyer. Elaine intercepted me before I reached the hallway. She wore a tailored burgundy dress, her posture rigid, her hair blown out into a stiff, flawless bob. She hugged me, a brittle and brief contact, and her hands immediately slid down my waist, mapping my physical dimensions beneath my wool sweater. She stepped back, her eyes dropping to my hips for a fraction of a second before snapping up to my face. She did not say a word about my body. She did not have to. The assessment was logged, the baseline established. I walked into the living room and found a quiet spot near the limestone fireplace. Aunt Susan was there, nursing a glass of dry white wine. Uncle David was debating golf courses with a cousin from Ohio. I stood back and watched my mother work the room. She hovered near the past hors d'oeuvres, her gaze tracking every silver tray. When a server offered her a bacon-wrapped date, she held up her hand as if he had offered her toxic waste. She watched her siblings eat. She watched their spouses eat. But mostly, she watched me. Chloe arrived 30 minutes later with her husband. My sister looked radiant, carrying a small plate piled high with baked brie, crackers, and fig jam. Elaine greeted her with a genuine, relaxed smile. Chloe ate the cheese, laughed at something Uncle David said, and moved through the living room with the easy grace of someone who had never been catalogued as a problem. I stood by the mantel, sipping sparkling water, feeling the familiar, quiet burn of being the designated project. I wanted to leave right then. My pulse ticked a steady rhythm against my collarbone, a biological warning to retreat. I ignored the instinct. I told myself I was observing her pathology, gathering data like a good clinician. That was my first miscalculation. You cannot be an impartial observer in a room where you are the target. By 5 o'clock, the caterers had finished arranging 2 massive tables in the formal dining room. They were draped in heavy white linen and lined with silver chargers. Place cards dictated the seating arrangement with military precision. Elaine sat at the head of the primary table. She had placed me halfway down, directly in her line of sight, flanked by Aunt Susan and a quiet cousin who rarely spoke. Chloe was seated near Elaine, a position of honor and safety. The food was served family style. Heavy ceramic bowls of stuffing, glazed carrots, sliced turkey, and rich gravies moved down the line, passed from hand to hand. For the last 10 Thanksgivings, I had performed a specific defensive routine. I would take a small piece of dry white meat, fill the rest of my plate with undressed greens, and push the food in circles until dinner ended. I did this to keep the peace. I did this to survive the meal without becoming the main course. This time, I decided to act like the adult I was. I took the serving spoon and plated a standard, balanced meal. A piece of turkey, a spoonful of green beans, a moderate scoop of mashed potatoes. It was not a mountain of food. It was a normal, sustaining portion for an adult woman. I set the serving spoon down and picked up my fork. The dining room was loud. 40 people talking over each other, the clinking of silverware against porcelain, the scraping of chairs, wine glasses being refilled. It was a comfortable, chaotic hum of family members catching up on a year of life. Elaine waited for the exact moment the conversation near our end of the table dipped. She did not raise her voice. She never used volume when precision worked better. She used her concerned, maternal register, a tone carefully calibrated to sound supportive while slipping a blade under your ribs. "Harper, sweetie." She sighed the words. The sound was loud enough to cut through the ambient noise. 2 conversations stopped. Then 3. The quiet cascaded down the long table like falling dominoes until all eyes turned toward the head of the room. "Are we sure we need that heavy carbohydrate?" She tilted her head, her expression a mask of pure, loving worry. She gestured toward my plate with her wine glass, the crystal catching the light from the chandelier. "You have been looking a bit puffy lately, and I would hate to see you relapse into your greedy habits." The dining room went entirely dead. The silence was physical, a heavy, suffocating blanket thrown over 40 people. The word greedy hung in the air, vibrating. It was a word she used when I was 12 years old, catching me eating a piece of bread in the kitchen after dinner. She had kept it stored away for 2 decades, repurposing it now for an audience. I did not look at my plate. I looked at the people around me. Aunt Susan carefully placed her napkin in her lap and stared intently at her water glass, desperate to be invisible. Uncle David cleared his throat and suddenly found the floral centerpiece fascinating. Nobody moved to defend me. I looked at Chloe. My sister, the woman who had watched me cry in my bedroom as a teenager, the woman who knew exactly what this behavior did to me. Chloe stared at the far wall. She took a slow sip of her red wine and chose her usual, cowardly silence. She was protecting her peace by sacrificing mine. She knew that defending me meant drawing our mother's focus onto herself, and she was not willing to pay that price. Finally, I looked at Elaine. My mother was sitting at the head of the table with a tight, nervous smile on her face. Her posture was rigid, her knuckles white around the stem of her glass. The tragic part was that she was not trying to be cruel, just for the sake of malice. In her warped, fractured mind, she fully believed she was staging a loving, necessary intervention. She thought she was saving me from a terrible fate. She expected me to flush with shame. She waited for me to mutter a quiet apology, put my fork down, and retreat to the guest bathroom in tears, validating her role as the vigilant protector. She waited for the child she had trained to shrink. Elaine waited for the familiar script to play out. For 20 years, the choreography of our family dinners had never changed. She would deliver a public correction regarding my body or my plate. I would flush a deep, painful red. I would lower my eyes, murmur a quiet apology to the room, and push my chair back. The guest bathroom was my usual sanctuary, a place to lock the door and wait for my breathing to return to normal, while Elaine accepted quiet nods of solidarity from the aunts. I looked at her sitting at the head of the long table. Her chin was slightly raised. Her hands rested politely beside her crystal goblet. She was ready to receive her validation. She was ready to be the martyred mother, carrying the heavy burden of a flawed daughter. I felt the familiar rush of adrenaline hit my bloodstream, that biological command telling me to flee. But I did not stand up. I did not look at the floor. I picked up my cloth napkin, wiped my mouth, and placed it neatly next to my plate. The silence stretched. The lack of my retreat confused her. I saw a tiny furrow appear between her eyebrows. The script was broken. I set my fork down. The metal clinked against the porcelain. It was the only sound in the room. I took a slow breath. In my practice downtown, I sit across from patients who employ aggressive defense mechanisms. I spend my days untangling deep-rooted trauma, disguised as anger or care. I am trained to keep my pulse steady when a patient attempts to transfer their pain onto me. I simply had never applied my professional training to the woman who gave birth to me. Until tonight. I looked directly into her eyes. My voice came out flat, detached, and perfectly level. I sounded exactly as I do when reading a diagnostic summary to a colleague. I am not relapsing, Mom, I said. But you are projecting. Aunt Susan inhaled sharply. Uncle David shifted his weight, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. Elaine blinked. The confident, maternal mask faltered for a fraction of a second. Excuse me, she said. Her tone was breathless, feigning confusion. I kept my hands folded loosely on the table. I did not lean forward. I did not raise my pitch. I delivered a cold, clinical audit of her mental state to a room of 40 captive listeners. I am pointing out a textbook psychological projection, I continued. For my entire life, you have used my body as a proxy to manage your own untreated trauma. You are terrified of losing control, so you attempt to control what goes onto my plate. You weigh your portions by the gram. You exercise until you require physical therapy for your joints. Those are not habits of health. They are the behaviors of a severe, unmanaged eating disorder. Elaine opened her mouth to speak, but she had no words ready. The room was paralyzed. Families like mine survive by enforcing an unspoken rule. We ignore the dysfunction and pretend the symptoms are personality quirks. By applying clinical terminology, I was stripping away the disguise of maternal care. I laid the pathology bare under the bright dining room lights. Your compulsion to restrict my food is not an act of love, I stated, maintaining direct eye contact. It is narcissistic projection. You use public humiliation to self-soothe your own anxiety. You try to shrink me because your own mind is a prison of restriction, and seeing me eat a normal meal threatens the fragile architecture of your illness. Elaine lost her color entirely. The flush of control drained from her cheeks, leaving her pale and visibly shaking. Her hands dropped from the table to her lap. She looked around the room, searching for an ally. Low, frantic whispers broke out at the far end of the table. Uncle David cleared his throat loudly. "Now, Harper, let's just eat our turkey," he muttered, a weak, desperate attempt to reset the room. I ignored him, keeping my eyes locked on my mother. The rest of the relatives went back to staring at their plates, trapped in the uncomfortable glare of the truth. I had not insulted her. I had not called her a single derogatory name. I had simply diagnosed her. And to a woman who built her entire identity on being flawless, a diagnosis was the ultimate destruction. "Harper," she stammered. Her voice was thin, stripped of its usual authority. "I just want you to be healthy. You know I worry." That was the moment Chloe intervened. My younger sister, the one who had eaten her pasta in peace for 2 decades while I was starved. The one who knew exactly how much damage Elaine had done to my psyche. Chloe slammed her hand flat against the table. The sound echoed off the high ceilings. "You are being cruel, Harper," Chloe cried. Her voice was shaking with panic. "She is our mother. You do not get to speak to her like she is one of your crazy patients." I shifted my gaze to my sister. I watched as Chloe protectively pulled her plate of food a few inches closer to her chest, her knuckles turning white. She glanced frantically at the aunts and uncles, desperate for someone to nod in agreement. When no one did, she unconsciously crossed her arms, perfectly mirroring our mother's rigid, defensive posture. She was terrified. If Elaine lost me as the designated target, the crosshairs would inevitably find a new focus. Chloe needed me to remain the problem so she could remain the safe, favored daughter. The cost of my truth became immediately clear. I watched her physically retreat into the comfortable lie, lacking the courage to stand in the truth with me. There was a bitter clarity in that realization. Every major success carries a cost. My freedom meant accepting that I could not carry these people with me. I could not heal a family that preferred the sickness. I looked at Chloe. I did not argue with her. I did not try to convince her. I just let her words hang in the silent room, exposing her cowardice to anyone paying attention. I looked back at Elaine, who was now dabbing the corner of her eye with a cloth napkin, playing the victim she so desperately needed to be. I had said everything that needed to be said. The audit was complete. I picked up my water glass, took a final sip, and set it down. I pushed my chair back from the table. It made a smooth, quiet sound on the rug. I stood up to my full height. I did not storm away. I walked toward the foyer with measured, even steps. The weaponized silence of my departure filled the space I left behind. The November air hit my face the moment I stepped out of the Evanston house. It was biting, the kind of Midwestern cold that sharpens your senses. I handed my ticket to the valet, tipped him, and waited for my sedan. Before walking out the front door, I had stopped at the mahogany console table in the foyer. I placed a thick manila envelope next to a decorative vase. It had my mother's full name printed on the front. I did not say goodbye to the attendant. I simply walked out. The drive down Lake Shore Drive was uneventful. I kept the radio off. I watched the city skyline grow larger against the dark sky. My pulse, which had held steady during the dining room confrontation, finally began to slow. I did not feel a rush of victory. I felt the specific, hollow exhaustion that follows a major surgical procedure. I had excised a rotting appendage. The relief would come later. Right now, There was just the quiet reality of the wound. I unlocked the door to my condo in the Loop shortly before 9 o'clock. I hung my coat in the closet. I kicked off my shoes. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of tap water, and finally pulled my phone from my purse. The screen was a solid wall of notifications. The numbers climbed as I watched. 12 missed calls. 34. By 10 o'clock, the counter hit 68. They were not just from Elaine. There were calls from Chloe, from Aunt Susan, from Uncle David, and from cousins who had not spoken to me in 5 years. The voicemails began to process. I did not listen to all of them. I played the first 3. Elaine's voice was unrecognizable. It lacked the polished, breathy control she maintained in public. She sounded fractured, her sentences running together, demanding I return and explain myself to the family. Aunt Susan left a message asking what the documents meant, her tone laced with a discomfort that bordered on fear. Chloe left a voicemail that was mostly just her crying, calling me ungrateful and demanding I apologize for ruining the holiday. They were not calling because I walked out of dinner. Walking out was a standard family drama. They were calling because of the envelope I left on the console table. Inside that envelope was not an angry letter. There were no emotional pleas, no childhood grievances written in tears. Anger is a currency my mother understands. She knows how to spend it, how to manipulate it, how to play the victim against it. I did not give her anger. I gave her paperwork. The envelope contained the boundary letter I had written in my own therapy sessions, along with brochures for 3 intensive inpatient eating disorder clinics in Illinois. It was not written on my practice letterhead. I did not write it as her doctor, but as the daughter who had survived her. I itemized her behaviors over the last 2 decades with cold, clinical precision, stating clearly that I would block her number until she checked herself into one of these facilities. I documented the caloric restriction she imposed on her dependent child. I listed the arbitrary weight parameters she enforced. I detailed her obsessive exercise routines, her food hoarding, and her systemic use of public humiliation as a response to narcissistic injury. I cited the specific diagnostic criteria for severe orthorexia nervosa and enmeshment trauma, demonstrating how she used my body as a proxy to manage her own psychiatric terror. I included dates, patterns, and the exact words she used to shrink me. I knew exactly what would happen when I left it on that table. Elaine is a woman who needs an audience. When she found the envelope, she likely assumed it was an apology letter. She probably opened it right there in the living room, surrounded by her siblings, expecting to read my contrition aloud. Instead, she exposed her own clinical diagnosis to 40 people. The aunts and uncles who had enabled her for decades suddenly held a piece of paper that named the dysfunction they had spent their lives pretending not to see. The 68 missed calls were not outrage. They were panic. The facade had been systematically dismantled in front of the entire neighborhood. The resistance I faced over the next few days was textbook. People do not easily let go of the systems that keep them comfortable. Elaine outright refused the referral. She doubled down on her delusion, telling the extended family that my degree had made me arrogant and that I was fabricating medical documents to punish her. She threatened to report my license to the state board, a baseless threat considering I had explicitly written the letter as a family member enforcing a boundary, not as a clinician offering treatment. When that failed, she transitioned into sudden, unexplained medical ailments, attempting to draw the family back into her orbit of care. I ignored it. The true cost of my decision arrived on Tuesday morning. I opened my laptop to find a lengthy email from Chloe. My sister did not call me. She chose the safety of text. The email was a masterclass in cognitive dissonance. She wrote that she could not cope with the tension I had created. She blamed me for shattering our mother's fragile health. She stated that while Elaine might have been strict, I had weaponized my education to destroy our family. Chloe could not handle the guilt of her own complicity. Accepting my evaluation of our mother meant accepting that she had sat by and watched me be abused for 20 years while eating her own dinner in peace. The weight of that realization was too heavy for her. So she chose the lie. She formally requested that I cease all contact with her. She chose the illness because the illness provided her with a role she understood. I read the email twice. I did not draft a response. I archived the message in a folder. I lost my family that night. There was no tearful reconciliation. There was no sudden moment of clarity where my mother realized the error of her ways and begged for my forgiveness. American families rarely resolve their deep systemic traumas with a cinematic embrace. Most of the time, the ending is just quiet paperwork, blocked numbers, and the sudden cessation of holiday invitations. The cost of my freedom was complete estrangement. I had to mourn the sister I thought I had and accept the sister she actually was. I had to bury the hope that my mother would ever look at me without calculating my caloric intake. It was a heavy, persistent grief, but it was a clean grief. It was not the muddy, suffocating pain of living inside their delusion. I sat in my kitchen. The condo was incredibly quiet. The traffic from the street below hummed a steady, distant rhythm. I opened my phone settings and systematically blocked Elaine, Chloe, and every aunt and uncle who had stood by and watched me shrink. I watched their names disappear from my contact list one by one. I stood up and walked to my refrigerator. I opened the door and looked at the shelves. I took out a container of leftover pasta, warmed it on the stove, and placed it in a ceramic bowl. I sat at my own dining table, alone, without an audience, without a judge. I picked up my fork and took a bite. The food was warm and sustaining. For the first time in 32 years, my pulse did not race while I chewed. I ate the entire bowl. I washed the dish and left it on the drying rack. I turned off the kitchen light and walked into the living room, realizing with profound, unshakable certainty that I had finally stopped starving. If a relative ever made you feel small at a family party while hiding their own mess, you already know how this ends. Take this as your sign to stop eating their lies. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.